The morning of her father's funeral was the kind of cold that seeped into the bones. A slow, silent ache that matched the emptiness inside Leila Hassan's chest. The sky hung heavy and gray, its clouds thick with the kind of sorrow that seemed to press down on everything. A bitter wind swept through the cemetery, tugging at her black scarf as she stood at the edge of the freshly dug grave. Her father had been her world. Omar Hassan wasn't just a parent, he was her teacher, her protector, the one constant presence in a life full of quiet storms. He was the man who taught her to believe that kindness mattered, that family meant something sacred. But as the sound of shovels striking earth filled the air, Leila realized how fragile those beliefs had become. Her father's second wife, Nabila, stood near the head of the grave, perfectly composed. She wore a veil of feigned grief, her red, painted nails clutching a silk handkerchief that stayed perfectly dry. On either side of her were Leila's two older half-brothers, Khalid and Samir, men who had once teased her like brothers, but who now wouldn't even meet her eyes. The moment the last handful of dirt hit the coffin, Leila felt something change. The subtle glances, the murmured words, the cold distance, it all hinted at something unspoken, something waiting just beyond the grave. When the ceremony ended, people began to drift away. Old friends offered their condolences. Neighbors whispered about what a good man Omar had been, but Leila couldn't move. She stood rooted in place, her boots sinking slightly into the damp soil as she stared at her father's name etched into the wooden marker. The world felt quieter without him, too quiet. By evening, the family had gathered at the house where she had grown up. The lights were dim, the air thick with the scent of incense and tension. Every room in that house carried her father's presence. His books on the shelf, his jacket still hanging by the door, his framed photo on the mantel. But that comfort was short-lived. Nabila took charge quickly, as she always did. The lawyer arrived, briefcase in hand, to read the will. Leila sat near the edge of the room, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her father had promised her that everything would be shared equally. He had said it so many times that she had never thought to doubt him. But as the lawyer's voice droned on, reading line after line, a sickening realization spread through her. The company her father built gone. The family home, gone. The savings, gone. Everything had been signed over to Nabila and her sons. When the lawyer announced her name, it was only to state that she had been adequately provided for. And then came the final blow: her name had been struck from the title deed of the house. It didn't make sense. The words blurred together. Her father wouldn't have done this. Not willingly. Her stepmother's eyes met hers, calm and sharp, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. Khalid and Samir avoided looking at her altogether. That night, Leila packed her things quietly. She didn't argue. She didn't cry in front of them. She moved through the house like a ghost, taking only what she had brought into it. Her clothes, her books, and one photograph of her and her father, taken years ago on the day she graduated high school. By midnight, she stood at the door with her small suitcase, staring into the darkness outside. The home she had grown up in no longer belonged to her. She walked out without saying a word. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion. She rented a small, shabby apartment on the edge of town, where the pipes rattled and the lights flickered. Her savings barely covered rent, and she took a job at a local cafe, serving coffee to strangers who never looked her in the eye. Every night, she thought about her father. The warmth in his voice, the strength in his laughter. He would never have left her with nothing. Something was wrong. Then came the whispers. A friend from her father's old company told her that after his death, the business had been sold, quietly, discreetly, to a private buyer. The paperwork had been signed just days after the funeral. The buyer, a shell company registered under her stepmother's name. It all fit. The new will, the missing records, the sudden transfer of ownership. Nabila had planned everything, but Leila had no proof. Not yet. Late one night, unable to sleep, she found herself rummaging through her old boxes. Inside one, tucked beneath a stack of letters, she found an envelope addressed to her in her father's handwriting. Her heart stopped as she opened it. Inside was a single brass key. No explanation, no letter, only a small label tied to it that read, "For when you need to remember who you are." The words made no sense, but the key was familiar. She turned it over in her hands, trying to recall where she had seen it before. And then, like a distant memory surfacing from fog, she remembered. Her father's private office at the company. The one no one but he ever entered. He used to keep it locked, always saying it contained his life's work. Maybe the answers were there. The next morning, she made up her mind. She would go to her father's office building, find out what he left behind, and finally uncover the truth. But as she approached the glass doors later that day, her reflection staring back at her, she realized something that sent a chill through her body. Someone else had already been there. The door was unlocked. The lights were on. And faintly, from down the hallway, she could hear footsteps echoing in the silence. Someone was searching, too. Leila's heart pounded as she stood in the dimly lit hallway of her late father's office building. The once familiar place felt foreign now, hollow and cold, as though the warmth her father had brought into it had vanished with him. The faint hum of fluorescent lights echoed above, and every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of air vents, felt louder than it should have. The sound of footsteps grew closer, slow, deliberate. Whoever was there didn't belong. She pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow, listening. The steps stopped at the end of the corridor, near her father's private office. That office, her father's sanctum, had always been off limits to everyone but him. Even as a child, she remembered trying to peek inside, only to be gently turned away. Some doors, he had said once, are meant to be opened only when the time is right. Now, that time had come. When the footsteps faded, she crept toward the door. The brass plate still read Leila Hassan, founder and CEO. But the door, once sealed by her father's key, hung slightly ajar. Her pulse quickened. Someone had been there recently. Pushing it open, she stepped inside. The office was dustier than she remembered, though not untouched. Papers were scattered across the desk. A chair was pushed back, and faint fingerprints smudged the glass of the display cabinet where her father used to keep his awards. She could almost sense him there. The faint trace of his cologne, the lingering presence of his quiet discipline. Leila moved slowly, scanning the room. Her eyes fell on the large oak desk, its drawers slightly open. She walked around it, trying the key in each lock. Most didn't fit, but when she reached the bottom drawer, the key slid in smoothly. Her breath caught. Inside, neatly stacked, were several brown envelopes. Each was labeled with handwritten dates spanning the last 5 years. She pulled one out and opened it. Inside were financial statements, contracts, and letters. Many bore the company logo, but what made her stomach twist were the signatures. Her stepmother's, forged in a familiar but slightly uneven hand. It became clear as she sifted through the papers. Nabila had been siphoning money from the company long before her father's death. Quietly, carefully, hiding the transactions under shell accounts and dummy corporations. And then, one document made her freeze entirely, a medical report, her father's. It showed early signs of heart disease, diagnosed months before he died. But the file also contained something else, a prescription list, and a note recommending immediate monitoring and reduced stress. Her father hadn't mentioned being sick. He had always seemed so strong, so full of life. But if he'd known, why had he kept it secret? And then came the realization that turned her blood cold. His death hadn't been sudden. As everyone had said, it had been convenient. The door creaked behind her. Leila froze. She turned slowly to find Khalid standing there, arms crossed, his face caught between anger and fear. His eyes darted to the open drawer, then to the papers in her hands. For a moment, neither moved. The tension was suffocating. Then, without a word, he lunged forward. She dropped the papers, stumbling back, her heart slamming against her ribs. He grabbed for the envelope, his voice low and sharp, demanding that she leave. She refused to let go. The papers tore between them, half in his hand, half still in hers. For a moment, everything stopped. Khalid's eyes flickered with guilt, and then he stormed out, leaving her shaken but determined. That night, Leila sat in her apartment surrounded by the evidence she'd managed to keep. Her hands trembled as she pieced everything together. The financial fraud, the altered will, the strange circumstances of her father's death. The puzzle formed a picture too dark to ignore. Her stepmother had manipulated everything, the business, the inheritance, even the memory of her father. And Khalid was helping her. But how deep did it go? Leila spent the next few days quietly gathering information. She reached out to old employees, old friends of her father's, and even one of his lawyers who had mysteriously resigned a week before the will was finalized. Slowly, the truth began to emerge. The new will wasn't real. It had been rewritten under suspicious conditions, after her father was already bedridden. Witness signatures were forged. His lawyer had been replaced by one hired directly by Nabila, and just days after his death, the company's shares were transferred under the guise of business restructuring. Piece by piece, the plan became clear. Her stepmother had orchestrated everything, waiting until her father was too weak to fight back. And now, she and her sons lived lavishly on the fortune he had built with his bare hands. But Leila refused to let it end that way. Late one evening, she sat in her dim apartment, staring at the documents spread across her table. A storm raged outside, wind howling against the thin windows. The power flickered, casting the room in shadows. She felt alone, terrified even, but inside her, something stronger had begun to stir. It wasn't anger anymore, it was resolve. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Never let them take what defines you. She realized she had something they didn't, a truth they couldn't bury. She just needed the right way to use it. In the days that followed, she began building her case. Quietly, methodically, she scanned documents, backed up files, and gathered testimonies. She even tracked down one of her father's old business partners, who confirmed that Omar had been planning to name her as his rightful successor. But every step closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. Her calls were monitored. Her messages sometimes disappeared. Once, she returned home to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Nothing was stolen, but her desk drawers had been rifled through. Someone knew what she was doing, and they were trying to stop her. Still, she refused to back down. She found a journalist who had once reported on corporate corruption. After several ignored messages, she finally received a response, an invitation to meet in person, to share her evidence. It felt like hope. On the night of the meeting, she dressed carefully, hiding the USB drive with all her files in her coat pocket. She checked the time, 7:45 p.m., and stepped into the rain-soaked streets. The city lights blurred in the downpour as she made her way toward the cafe where they were supposed to meet. But when she arrived, the cafe was empty. No journalist, no message. Nothing. She waited 15 minutes, then 20. Her phone buzzed an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A cold, distorted voice came through the line. "Stop digging." "Leila," it said. Her breath caught. Before she could respond, the line went dead. The street outside had gone silent, and across the road, parked under a flickering streetlight, a dark car sat idling. Its headlights flashed once, then turned off. Leila clutched her coat, heart racing. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting to survive. Rain poured down in sheets that night, turning the streets into rivers of glistening black water. Leila stood frozen outside the cafe, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it over the roar of the storm. The dark car across the street hadn't moved. Its headlights flicked on again, and for a brief moment, she could see the faint outline of a figure inside. Watching, waiting. Fear crawled up her spine like ice. The voice on the phone echoed in her head, cold, distorted, and full of warning. Whoever had called her knew exactly what she was doing. And if they were willing to threaten her, it meant she was getting dangerously close to something they couldn't afford to let out. Leila turned quickly, slipping down a side street. The rain soaked her coat, the USB drive heavy in her pocket like a secret she couldn't let go of. She didn't go home that night. Instead, she checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, paying in cash, keeping her head down as she walked past the front desk clerk. The next morning, she woke to a world washed gray by the rain. Her phone had dozens of missed calls, mostly from unknown numbers. She didn't answer any of them. She couldn't risk it. Her only focus now was finding someone she could trust. But that was easier said than done. Her old friends avoided her calls. Her father's lawyer refused to meet. Even the few employees who had initially agreed to speak with her suddenly went silent. The fear that had kept her up at night had spread like a virus. Still, Leila refused to stop. She knew her father's memory deserved better than lies and silence. He had built his company from nothing, worked tirelessly to provide not just for his family but for the people who worked under him. He was a man of principle, someone who believed in fairness, loyalty, and honesty. To let those values be buried beneath greed would be to betray everything he had stood for. As days turned into weeks, Leila worked tirelessly. She spent hours in the library's archive room, combing through public records and old company filings. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. Patterns of hidden transactions, missing tax statements, and a string of suspicious business closures linked to Nabila's new company. She also discovered something else, a small charity account in her father's name, one that had remained untouched since his death. It contained only a modest amount of money, but its existence was a message. Her father had always believed in leaving a trail of honesty, no matter how small, and in that Leila found strength. It was during one of these long nights of research that she stumbled upon an old email backup linked to her father's business account. Buried deep within the archives was a message sent just 2 weeks before his death. It was addressed to himself with the subject line, "In case something happens." Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter. Her father had written about his fears. The pressure from his wife and stepsons to sign over company assets, the growing tension in the household, and his concerns that someone was manipulating his medications. He mentioned that he had entrusted key documents to his assistant, a woman named Hina, who had been with the company for over a decade. The final line of the email chilled Leila to the core. "If I am gone and you are reading this, Leila, find Hina. She knows the truth." Her father had known. He had known everything. The next morning, she began searching for Hina. It took days, but eventually, she found a lead, an address in a quiet neighborhood 2 towns over. She drove there in silence, her mind racing with what she would say, how she would convince the woman to trust her. When she arrived, she hesitated before knocking. The house was small, modest, with wilted flowers lining the front porch. An old car sat in the driveway, its windows fogged with rain. A faint movement behind the curtain caught her eye. Then, slowly, the door opened. Hina was older now, her face marked by years of worry. But when she saw Leila, her expression shifted from suspicion to shock, and then to something softer, recognition. Leila explained everything. Her father's death, the stolen company, the threats. Hina listened in silence, her eyes filling with tears as she retrieved a small tin box from a cupboard. Inside were sealed envelopes, flash drives, and hand-signed letters. She explained that Omar had entrusted them to her months before his death, asking her to keep them safe. He had suspected that Nabila was planning something and feared for his daughter's safety. Inside those envelopes were the final pieces of evidence Leila needed. Original company ownership documents, voice memos from her father, and signed letters verifying his intentions to make Leila his legal heir. It was proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof. But as Leila stared at the papers spread across the table, a heavy sense of dread crept in. If Nabila or her sons found out she had this evidence, they wouldn't just try to scare her. They would destroy her. She thanked Hina and left quietly, her mind already racing through her next move. She couldn't go to the police. They were connected to her stepbrothers through donations and influence. She couldn't go to the press. She had already seen what happened when she tried. There was only one option left. She would take them to court. But before she could make her move, the danger she had been trying to avoid found her. That night, as she drove back toward her motel, a pair of headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought nothing of it, but when she turned left, the car followed. When she turned again, it did too. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. The road ahead curved sharply, leading into a wooded area. Her heart raced as she realized she was being followed. The car behind her accelerated. Panic surged through her veins. She pressed harder on the gas pedal, her tires splashing through puddles as the rain fell harder. But the other car stayed close, too close. Then, suddenly, a loud bang echoed behind her. A flash of light filled her mirrors. The pursuing car had hit something, veering off the road and disappearing into the darkness. Leila didn't stop to look back. She kept driving until the lights of the city reappeared. When she finally pulled over, she was shaking uncontrollably. She didn't know who was in that car, Khalid, Samir, maybe even someone hired by Nabila. But she knew one thing for certain. They were getting desperate. She had the truth now, and they knew it. But they had no idea what she was willing to do next. The rain continued to fall, streaking across her windshield like tears from the sky. She gripped the steering wheel and whispered to herself, her voice trembling but resolute. They took everything from her, her home, her father's legacy, her peace. Now she would take it all back. The morning after the chase, Leila barely slept. Her hands still trembled every time she replayed the night in her mind. The headlights behind her, the sound of screeching tires, the explosion of light as the car spun out of control. She didn't know who was behind the wheel, but she didn't need to. The message had been clear. Stop, or suffer the consequences. But Leila had reached a point of no return. She wasn't the same woman who had quietly walked out of her family home with a suitcase and a broken heart. She had been humiliated, betrayed, hunted, and somehow, she was still standing. That strength terrified the people who had tried to destroy her. Leila spent the next few days gathering her courage and building her case. Heine's evidence was like gold. It included everything from bank records to notarized letters, and even a recording of Omar Hassan himself, naming Leila as his rightful successor. The audio was faint, but his voice was unmistakable, firm, sincere, and filled with the love of a father trying to protect his daughter. Hearing his words made Leila cry for the first time in weeks. She let herself grieve, not just for her father, but for the version of herself she had lost when her family turned on her. And then she got to work. She contacted a lawyer, a young, ambitious woman named Zara Malik, recommended by a mutual friend from university. Zara was known for taking on powerful people and winning. When Leila showed her the evidence, Zara's expression hardened. She didn't hesitate. "This is enough to bury them," she said. For the first time, Leila felt like she had a fighting chance. The next week was a whirlwind of paperwork, affidavits, and sworn statements. Zara filed a motion to freeze the company's assets until ownership could be reviewed. She also submitted the forged will to be examined by handwriting experts. Within days, the case began to make noise in the business community. Quiet rumors spread through the city. Whispers that Omar Hassan's estate was under investigation, that his widow and sons might have stolen from his only daughter. When the story reached Nabila's household, the reaction was immediate. Leila began receiving anonymous threats again. She found a dead bird left on her doorstep. Her phone was flooded with messages warning her to drop the case. But she refused. The fear that once paralyzed her had become fuel. Every threat reminded her why she couldn't stop. And as the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. People who had once turned away from her started reaching out. Old employees from her father's company sent her their support. A few even provided statements revealing how they had been coerced by Nabila and her sons after Omar's death. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, a pattern of deceit, greed, and manipulation stretching back years. When the first hearing was scheduled, Leila walked into the courthouse with her head held high. Her nerves trembled, but her spirit didn't. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, and every creak of the wooden benches made her heart pound faster. On the other side of the room sat Nabila, dressed impeccably as always, her expression calm but her eyes sharp with venom. Khalid and Samir flanked her like silent guards. When Nabila's gaze met Leila's, she smiled faintly, as if to say, "You'll never win." But for the first time, Leila didn't look away. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings began with formalities, introductions, statements, and a review of the filed evidence. Leila sat quietly as Zara spoke with steady confidence, laying out the foundation of their case. When Nabila's lawyer responded, his tone was smooth and dismissive. He painted Leila as an unstable woman consumed by grief and jealousy, accusing her of fabricating stories to tarnish her family's name. Every word was a knife. But Leila didn't flinch. Then came the evidence. Zara presented the original will, the forged signatures, and the bank transfers. She played the recording of Omar's voice, filling the courtroom with the sound of truth. The moment the judge heard it, the energy in the room shifted. Nabila's lawyer immediately objected, calling it inadmissible and manipulated. But Zara countered, presenting metadata and certification that confirmed its authenticity. The hearing ended that day without a verdict, but Leila could tell the tide was turning. For the first time since her father's death, justice felt possible. Still, the victory came with a price. That night, when she returned home, she found her apartment door wide open. The lights were off, and the air felt heavy, thick with the metallic scent of fear. Her belongings were scattered, drawers pulled open, files torn apart. Her laptop was missing. They were trying to destroy her evidence. Fortunately, Leila had anticipated this. She had already made multiple backups, stored securely with her lawyer and in a cloud drive under an encrypted alias. But it wasn't about the files anymore. It was a message. A final warning. The next morning, the local news reported a suspicious fire at the Hassan Group's headquarters. The blaze had destroyed the upper floors where the archives were kept. Investigators called it an accident. Leila didn't believe that for a second. Her stepfamily was desperate. They were losing control. Zara urged her to stay cautious. They arranged private security for Leila, but she knew safety was an illusion now. Still, she didn't back down. The second hearing loomed closer, and this time the media had caught on. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Public opinion began to turn against Nabila, painting her as a greedy widow who exploited her husband's death for profit. The once polished image of the Hassan family began to crack. And then came a surprise. An anonymous email arrived in Leila's inbox. No sender, no subject, just a single attachment. Inside was a video file. When she played it, the screen flickered, then revealed a recording from inside her father's old office. The footage was dated the night before his death. The video showed Nabila and Khalid standing near Omar's desk. Her father was seated pale and visibly weak, pleading with them. Nabila's expression was cold, her words sharp. Though the audio was faint, one phrase came through clearly. "If you won't sign it, you'll leave me no choice." Leila froze. This was it. The proof no one could deny. The missing piece her father must have recorded himself as insurance. She immediately sent it to Zara. Within hours, they filed an emergency motion to include the video in the case. When Nabila's lawyer saw it, his confidence shattered. For the first time, Leila saw fear in her stepmother's eyes. As the courtroom prepared for the next session, the whispers in the audience grew louder. The judge's expression hardened. The truth that Nabila had spent years burying was about to be revealed to the world. Leila stood tall in that courtroom, knowing there was no turning back now. She wasn't fighting for money or property anymore. She was fighting for her father's name, for justice, and for every wound her stepfamily had inflicted. She knew the road ahead would be brutal. The threats would continue, the lies would multiply, but the truth had already begun to shine, and once light enters darkness, it cannot be undone. As the judge called her name, Leila took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face the storm. The courtroom was overflowing the morning the new evidence was presented. Reporters packed the benches, their cameras flashing in bursts that illuminated every tense face in the room. The air buzzed with anticipation, thick with the weight of truth on the verge of revelation. Leila sat beside her lawyer, her hands clasped tightly together, the faint hum of her heartbeat echoing in her ears. It had been months since her father's death, months of fear, betrayal, and silence, but today that silence was finally being shattered. Zara stood confidently before the judge, holding a small USB drive between her fingers, the video file that had arrived in Leila's inbox. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and calm, "this evidence was recovered from a secure backup drive belonging to the late Mr. Omar Hassan. It directly pertains to the validity of the will and the circumstances of his death." Across the room, Nabila's face drained of color. Khalid fidgeted beside her, his jaw tightening as the judge gestured for the bailiff to begin playback. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen came to life. The room went silent. The recording was grainy, but the image was unmistakable. Omar Hassan sat behind his desk, his face pale and wary, his breathing shallow. Nabila stood over him, arms crossed, her voice sharp and commanding. Khalid lingered near the door, restless, almost agitated. The audio crackled before clearing just enough to catch the words that would end everything. Nabila's voice filled the courtroom. "You will sign it. You owe this family everything. Don't make me regret trusting you." Omar's weak reply followed, trembling but defiant. "You're not doing this for family. You're doing it for greed." Then, the chilling final line came. Nabila's cold, venomous whisper. "If you won't sign it, you'll leave me no choice." The recording ended abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, even the judge seemed lost for words. Then came a low murmur from the audience, a ripple of shock that spread like fire. Zara turned toward Nabila, her expression unreadable. "Your Honor, this footage corroborates the fraudulent will and proves undue influence over Mr. Hassan before his death. It also supports our claim that the transfer of assets and the subsequent company sale were conducted under coercion." Nabila's lawyer shot to his feet, shouting objections, claiming the video was doctored, that it was a malicious fabrication. But his voice faltered under the weight of the evidence. Even he could see the writing on the wall. The judge called for order. His gavel struck hard against the bench, echoing through the chamber. "This court will require forensic verification," he said sternly, "but this evidence is highly compelling." Leila's heart swelled with a mix of relief and disbelief. For the first time in what felt like forever, justice didn't seem like a dream. It felt within reach. Outside, the story spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed the scandal across every platform. Business icon's widow caught in inheritance fraud. Leila Hassan brings shocking evidence against stepmother. Hassan family empire under investigation for forgery in Khorasan. Within days, the company's stock plummeted. Investors pulled out. Nabila's carefully constructed world began to crumble. But the fallout wasn't just financial. Her social circle, the wealthy friends who had once admired her, turned their backs. The charity organization she chaired cut ties. The media camped outside her mansion, capturing her every grim expression. Leila, meanwhile, stayed quiet. She refused interviews, ignored the journalists who begged for her story. She didn't need attention. She needed closure. The second phase of the case began soon after, the criminal investigation. The forensic team confirmed the video's authenticity, as well as the forged signatures on the will. They also uncovered a disturbing trail of financial manipulation that linked Nabila and Khalid to offshore accounts used to launder company funds. The truth was undeniable. When the arrest warrants were issued, Leila watched the news coverage from her small apartment. The camera followed as police escorted Nabila out of her home. Her once perfect posture now slouched, her hands cuffed in front of her. Khalid and Samir followed shortly after, their faces pale and hollow. It should have felt like victory. But as Leila stared at the screen, all she felt was an aching sadness. Her father had loved these people. He had trusted them, and they had repaid that love with betrayal so deep it had torn their family apart. Still, justice had to be served. When the trial began, Leila attended every session. She sat quietly, watching the woman who had stolen her inheritance and peace of mind unravel piece by piece. Nabila tried to maintain her composure, but every witness, every document, every recording chipped away at her mask. Haina testified bravely, recounting how Omar had confided in her about Nabila's growing greed and her manipulation. Several former employees spoke of Khalid's threats and the forged company contracts. The prosecutor presented the offshore accounts, the hidden properties, the falsified tax returns. The case was airtight. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom was silent once again. The judge's voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of justice long denied. Nabila Hassan and Khalid Hassan are hereby found guilty of fraud, forgery, and criminal coercion. They are sentenced to 10 years in prison. Samir Hassan is found guilty of aiding and abetting and will serve 3 years. Gasps filled the room. Leila sat perfectly still, tears welling in her eyes. Not from triumph, but from release. The weight that had pressed on her heart for so long began to lift. The people who had taken everything from her were finally being held accountable. But even as they were led away in handcuffs, Nabila turned to her, her eyes burning with hatred. That last look said everything. A promise of revenge that even prison couldn't erase. Leila didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for her. In the months that followed, the company assets were liquidated, and the court restored ownership of her father's intellectual property to her. It wasn't the fortune that mattered. It was the vindication. She used part of the funds to rebuild her father's charity under a new name, the Omar Foundation. Its mission was to provide scholarships and legal aid to those wronged by family or corporate abuse. The story of her fight became an inspiration. She received hundreds of letters from strangers, women and men who had faced betrayal and prejudice but found hope in her courage. Yet, even as she began to rebuild her life, one truth lingered: victory came with scars. She had lost her innocence, her family, and the quiet life she once knew, but she had gained something more powerful. Strength forged from pain, a voice unshaken by fear, and the will to never again let injustice define her. And then, one morning, as she sat in her new office overlooking the city, an email notification appeared on her screen. No sender, no subject. Just a message that read, "You may have won this time, but the game isn't over." Leila stared at the words, her hand frozen over the mouse. A cold shiver ran through her. Justice had been served, but was it truly over? The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Leila's office, painting golden streaks across the polished floor. The city below was alive, bustling with noise and motion. Yet inside her new headquarters, there was only silence. The kind of calm that follows a storm too fierce to forget. Months had passed since the trial that brought her stepmother and stepbrothers to justice, but the echoes of that war still lingered in the corners of her mind. Leila had built something extraordinary from the ashes. The Omar Foundation had become more than a charitable organization. It had become a movement. Women and men who had been silenced, defrauded, or discarded found a voice through her. Legal cases she funded began winning across the country, each victory carrying her father's legacy further into the world. Still, that single message, the anonymous email that had arrived weeks earlier, haunted her. Its words, "You may have won this time, but the game isn't over," played in her mind like a ghostly whisper. She had traced it, reported it, even hired a cybersecurity firm. Nothing. It came from a dead server, bouncing through layers of encryption that made it untraceable. Yet, deep inside, she already knew Nabila. Even behind prison walls, her stepmother's venom had reach. She was the kind of woman who could turn bitterness into fuel, vengeance into strategy. And Leila knew. People like Nabila didn't fade quietly. But Leila wasn't the same fragile girl who had once cried herself to sleep after being thrown out of her home. She was stronger now, sharper, more determined. The day she received the invitation to the Business Women's Leadership Summit, she hesitated. It was to be held at the same five-star hotel where her father had once announced his final expansion. A place filled with memories of laughter, ambition, and, unknowingly, the beginning of her downfall. But after a moment of thought, she smiled and accepted. It was time to return not as the outcast daughter, but as the woman who had risen from betrayal to power. The summit was grand. The hall shimmered with chandeliers and expensive perfume, and the air buzzed with the chatter of the elite. Business leaders, investors, journalists, they all turned as Leila entered. The whispers followed her. "That's Leila Hassan, the one who exposed her stepmother. She's the one running the new foundation. Didn't her family lose everything?" Every word was laced with curiosity, envy, admiration. She moved through the crowd gracefully, her calm presence commanding attention. When she took the stage to speak, the room fell silent. Her speech wasn't about revenge or scandal. It was about rebuilding, how injustice can either break you or build you stronger than ever. Her voice was steady, her message powerful. By the time she finished, the crowd rose to its feet in applause. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward, eager for quotes. In that moment, Leila realized she had reclaimed everything they had tried to take from her. Her dignity, her name, her power. Later that evening, she returned to her car, her body tired but her heart light. She was ready to leave the past behind for good. But fate had one last twist waiting. As she stepped into the parking area, she noticed a man standing near her car, tall, slightly stooped, with thinning hair and an expensive suit that looked worn by time. His face was older, heavier, but unmistakable. Khalid. Her breath caught. For a brief moment, the world seemed to tilt. He shouldn't have been there. He had been sentenced to 10 years. It had only been 2. Her security guard instinctively stepped forward, but Khalid raised his hands in surrender. He wasn't there to threaten. He was there to beg. He had been released early for cooperating with investigators, his testimony against Nabila earning him leniency. His eyes were hollow now, the arrogance gone, replaced by regret and exhaustion. He told her in a trembling voice that Nabila had changed in prison, that she had spent her days plotting revenge, blaming Leila for everything, convincing herself she had been the victim. She had managed to make connections inside, people with influence and money. And before her final transfer to a maximum security facility, she had vanished during transport. Vanished. Leila felt her chest tighten, the email. The message, it all made sense now. For weeks after, her life became a cautious routine. Security was tightened, her movements monitored. She stopped going out alone. Every flicker of shadow felt like a threat, every anonymous call a warning. Yet through it all, she refused to show fear. Then, one morning, a letter arrived at her office. Handwritten in Nabila's sharp, looping script. "You took my empire, my sons, my name. But you forget one thing, Leila. I made you who you are. You learned from me. And that will haunt you forever." It wasn't a threat. It was a confession. A twisted acknowledgement that Nabila, in her cruelty, had forged the very strength that destroyed her. Leila folded the letter carefully and locked it in her drawer. She knew she would never report it, not because she was afraid, but because she no longer needed to fight. The war was over, even if her enemy refused to accept defeat. Time passed, and slowly, the shadows of the past faded. The world moved on, and so did Leila. Years later, the Omar Foundation grew into one of the country's most respected humanitarian organizations. It built schools, funded shelters, and provided thousands of scholarships in her father's name. Her story, from betrayal to triumph, became part of its legacy, shared to inspire others who faced cruelty and prejudice. And then, one afternoon, as she walked through the Foundation's new training center, she stopped by a small plaque near the entrance. It read, "In honor of those who were cast aside, may they find the strength to rise again." She smiled. That was her father's lesson. That goodness, no matter how small, outlasts greed. That truth always finds a way to surface. As she left the building, she glanced at the city skyline. The sun was setting, bathing everything in gold. Somewhere, perhaps Nabila still watched from the shadows, clinging to bitterness. But Leila no longer cared. She had won the only victory that mattered: peace. Her family had kicked her out, taken her inheritance, tried to erase her. But she had rebuilt her life from nothing, proving that no cruelty could define her destiny. And in the end, the people who had once looked down on her now looked up to her. A symbol of resilience, justice, and grace. The girl who had been thrown away had become the woman everyone admired. Her father's voice echoed faintly in her mind, soft and proud. "They can take everything, but they can't take who you are." Leila smiled through quiet tears as the last light of day faded behind the horizon. She had been betrayed. She had been broken. But she had risen, higher than they ever imagined. And in that triumph, in that calm after the storm, she finally understood the power of her father's last lesson. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply smiles, knowing that the last laugh belongs to those who never stopped believing.